While working on last week's video, I was struck by just how much the Odyssey had to say about Xenia, but also how much it had to say on religious epiphany, or divine experiences in which the gods make themselves known to us. Though the Greek word epiphania only came about in the Hellenistic era, the conversation around divine experiences was ongoing in antiquity, and I would argue some of the first arguments made were in the epics of Homer and Hesiod, as well as the so-called Homeric hymns. So, how do you figure out if you're going crazy if you have a divine experience? Let's take a look. Kairete. Yet again, I read far too many papers, many by scholars being far too dismissive of divine experiences for my taste to prep for this video. The topic of divine experience and discernment is massive, and I don't expect to be able to cover it all here. However, I'd still like to give you some things to consider if you have UPG or unverified personal gnosis of your own that you're trying to figure out. Ocean Keltoy's video on UPG is linked above. I plan on doing my own at some point to expand on his work and to take a look at a few aspects I think are pertinent specifically to Hellenism, but for now, it's a really good starting point. He also did a video, now linked in the iCard above, about religious doubt and certainty, topics that'll come up later in this video. I highly recommend his take on certainty and skepticism. With all that said, in my video on Xenia, I mentioned that the Odyssey and the Iliad were both cautionary tales regarding Xenia, and although this is true, another major theme in both of them and the Homeric hymns is epiphany. Today, the word epiphany has been watered down to mean just about any light bulb style idea that seems to strike you from the sky, but for the longest time in scholarship specifically, it referred to a god manifesting in front of a human, either physically or as a vision in their mind. This is but one type of divine experience, and although relatively plentiful in the epics, as well as other ancient and modern works of fiction, it is, as far as we know, the rarest type of divine experience that humans might have. Through the lens of the Odyssey, Homer had a lot to say about how this sort of divine experience might come about, however. In Odyssey 1, Telemachus had a divine experience with Athena, where she shows up disguised as the guest Mente and tests his willingness to host her despite his wariness with the entire concept of Xenia following a gaggle of crappy house guests depleting his father's fortune. He never figures out it was she until the very end when she flies away, quote, like a bird and instills strength in his heart, but throughout the time that they interact, it's clear that he and the others know the gods do pay visits to mortals and test them. This sort of visit, the divine test and reveal, happens a second time with Odysseus when he first lands at Ithaca in Odyssey 13. She disguises herself as a shepherd boy and he lies to her about his identity to protect himself. Once she's satisfied that he has passed the test, she reveals herself and they plot together to overcome the suitors. However, not everyone gets a reveal, even if a divine visits the space they're in and has intent on someone else. Despite having visited Telemachus before in Odyssey 1, in Odyssey 16, Athena visits again, and Homer goes out of his way to note that Telemachus not only can't see her, but that it is by her will that he not recognize her for what she is or even notice her. Instead, we get a semi-mistaken epiphany where Telemachus believes his father, Odysseus, who had just been blessed by Athena and had his disguise removed, was in fact the god in that interaction. Odysseus denies this rightfully, of course, but it is an important point. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, we have a divine test that was an occurrence of happenstance where Demeter, while grieving, ends up punishing a mortal woman for doubting her when she was disguised as a stranger. This woman was not deliberately sought out by Demeter the way that Athena sought out Odysseus and Telemachus, but the encounter happened in disguise all the same. All of us have had a feeling after encountering a stranger that we might have been in the presence of the divine, or at the very least that the divine was somehow involved. However, as we can see from the above examples, the gods don't always reveal themselves to everyone. In fact, someone standing next to you in ritual could have a divine experience or vision, and you could miss it because the god willed it so, or had a message specifically for the other person. In the case of Telemachus, the divine was at work, but he mistook a mortal under divine influence for being himself divine. In other words, the doubt you as the viewer might be feeling about your own experiences that may or may not be divine, even in some of the oldest records we have from ancient Greece, was found in the ancients whose culture continuously reinforced belief in the gods. So, you might ask, why would the gods disguise themselves like this if it causes so much frustration and they have the ability to keep others from noticing them if they choose? Well, according to Homer, it's likely because when we see them in their true forms, they, terrify us. In the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, it was said that Aphrodite disguises herself as an unwed human maiden when she appears to Achates, so that he would, quote, not see her and be afraid. When Athena lifts the mists from the eyes of Diomedes in the Iliad so he can see gods on the battlefields, Ares in particular is described as brazen and terrible, in this case the translation meaning something closer to terrifying. Aphrodite, funnily enough, is not, but the feud between Aphrodite and Athena in the Iliad is a subject for another video. A moment of my own UPG, if I will. When I had my vision of Athena that led me to Hellenism, the overwhelming feeling of awe, like standing above the Grand Canyon and watching the ancient river flow under a starry, light pollutionless sky but multiplied by billions, could very well be likened to fear. I can certainly see why the ancients who had contacts with the gods felt that way, and many in my server and in the wider community have described similar feelings in intense encounters with the gods. If they disguise themselves, they're less likely to scare us, so we're more likely to listen to their message, even if we might doubt what just happened for a while if they don't give us a strong tell, like, flying away or transforming fathers back to their youthful glory. Which begs the question, if a god doesn't deliberately reveal themselves, how can we figure out that we've had a divine experience? Well, if the epics are anything to go by, the best we can do is infer from the intensity of the message and the significance of the encounter. However, as was the case with Nausicaa in the Odyssey, when Athena came to her in a dream disguised as a woman her age and made suggestions without Nausicaa ever realizing she had been there, it's possible that we can have these encounters without ever knowing we had them or that we played an important role in something that the gods called us to do. In the journal Phoenix, Catherine Chu examined the question of identifying divine epiphanies in her essay Eyeing Epiphanies in Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit texts. Her conclusion was that unlike the Indian gods who have obvious tells like lacking shadows, not sweating, or standing hovering above the ground, the Greek gods only appear to reveal themselves when they so choose. In other words, the so-called mists in our eyes, like they were for Diomedes, can only be removed at the bidding of the god themselves. Chances are, if you believe that you've had an encounter with a god because you've seen something in their departure or a message that makes you feel as though that encounter were unmistakably divine, there's a good chance that that might be the case. Which brings us to dreams. Thomas Vitek takes a look at dreams recorded throughout fiction and non-fiction in antiquity in his paper Allegorical Dreams in Antiquity, Their Character and Interpretation. He opens by noting that the only complete dream interpretation manual we have surviving from antiquity in Greece is Artemidoros's The Interpretation of Dreams from the 2nd century CE. So far later than I usually reconstruct from, but the book is a wealth of information on various attitudes toward the categories of dreams and how the ancient professional interpreters would classify them. Artemidoros provides 5 different classifications for dreams. 1. The divinatory dream or oneros, which predicts the future and provides some divine instructions for action. 2. The vision or orama, which shows future events directly in some way. 3. The prophecy or krematismos, which enlightened people about the true state of things, especially through speech. 4. The illusion or onuknion, which merely presented reflections of true realities and activities of the soul and bodies. And 5. Nightmares or phantasmata, behind which stand various illnesses and disorders. This division has within it 3 categories of dreams which can be considered divine in nature, categories 1, 2, and 3, 2 of which are direct enough as to not need interpretation, namely visions and prophecies, which leaves a more allegorical category, which hides its meaning behind symbolism and requires interpretation. It's important to mention that there's no real hard borders separating epiphanic and allegorical dreams, as quite often the two mix and mingle within the same experience. Thus, a god could appear in a dream and speak directly to the person dreaming, but the words used could be allegorical and thus require interpretation. Interpretation is no straightforward matter either, as it turns out. Dream and omen interpretation are massive topics on their own and will be getting their own video sometime in the future, but for now, I'm going to state that symbolic interpretation in antiquity seemed far more personal and context dependent than the massive catalogs of alphabetized dream symbol books of today would lead us to believe. Even Artemidoros, who attempted to scientifically categorize symbols in what appears to be the first book of its kind, ultimately cedes to circumstance and context time and time again. In other words, just because a dream you had that might be divinely inspired has, say, modern symbolism in it, does not mean it isn't divine. It also doesn't mean that you have to align yourself with the so-called traditional symbolism when interpreting dreams you believe to be divine. If swans historically were always symbols of, say, Aphrodite, but you associate being chased by them with a horrid experience from your childhood, then when your gut tells you that the swans chasing you in your dream are a bad omen, there's no problem with believing that. This brings me to the third category of divine experience, that of divine influence within our lives. When Odysseus is fighting the suitors, Athena was said to have deflected their blows and protected him while he exacted justice. Herodotus, an ancient Greek historian, details an account of Athens praying to the north wind god Boreas to protect them from Xerxes when he's on his way to invade. When a strong north wind destroyed the incoming fleet, the Athenians built a shrine in Boreas' honor. This shows extraordinary circumstances were often attributed as divine experiences in antiquity. One of my own personal bits of UPG involves my oath to Athena to write the 101 book on Hellenism that I've been working on so long as I could get my hands on the materials that I needed to do a good job. After ritually making the oath, the same day, a friend of mine decided to spontaneously send me around $200. Keep in mind, I had not mentioned the oath or the book to this particular friend. I immediately called them them and demanded to know why, and they mentioned a book that I had been whinging about the price of while I was trying to get my hands on for an upcoming video. I had a price watch on it and checked, and the book, which had been sitting steadily at over $300 for months, had dropped down to $220. Given that I could now afford this book, which I regarded as essential for the video I was working on, the one on offerings, I took this as a positive sign from the god that my oath had been accepted. In that video on offerings, link in the iCard if you missed it, I talked about some of the various signs and omens that the ancients used to determine if their offerings, oaths, and prayers had been accepted. These are not the only methods that modern folks can use, but if you consider how the feelings of the worshipper were heavily considered for figuring out these sorts of things in antiquity, it seems silly how readily we discount our own gut feelings when it comes to divine communication. Although there are numerous forms of divination that were also considered divine communication, everything from ornithomancy, or the study of birds as omens from the gods, to oracles such as those at Delphi or oracles of the dead, I feel as though that topic is both so broad and so differently applied in antiquity as compared to today that it also needs its own series of videos in order to do it justice. That said, divination was frequently used to clarify messages sent in other ways, as well as to seek divine advice when a direct experience was not had following a prayer or request, and it can be useful even today in clarifying our own experiences. The last form of divine communication that I'd like to cover, that of tarsein, or the confidence given by a god to a believer, also deserves its own video. Its derivative word, tarsos, refers to the feeling of confidence generally, but in a religious context can mean both the confidence to approach a divine area, like a temple or temenos, knowing one's own purity or virtue, as well as be a direct communication of confidence from a god to let you know they have your back, as Athena did with Telemachus in Odyssey 1 when she left. This brings me to the elephant in the title, mental illness. Anti-theists and Christians often bring up mental illness when discussing divine experiences. However, speaking to several folks in the community with diagnosed conditions that include psychosis or delusions, here used in specifically the medical context to refer to hallucinations or convictions and beliefs with no basis in reality, the experience of the divine and the experience of the disorders often seem markedly different to those who have spent enough time in their faith to discern the difference between the two. The gods are disembodied minds, so there's no reason why our minds would not be the primary vehicle for communication with them. Mental illness should never be used as a bar from any experience with the divine, though I'd caution that it can make both the skill of discernment and its twin in interpretation far more difficult. I'll also stress that if you're concerned you have a psychiatric illness due to a divine experience, please don't let fear of invalidating it keep you from seeking help. There is no reason that the presence of that condition should invalidate the experience itself, and proper treatment will be an invaluable aid to developing the skills of discernment and interpretation essential to figuring it all out. We all have doubts, it's natural, the ancients shared them too. Fear of losing your faith should never be an excuse to harm yourself by allowing an untreated condition to run rampant in your life. We'll never know for certain whether our divine experiences are in fact from the gods. You're not a bad pagan for being worried that you're crazy or having doubts. We all do. Herodotus himself doubted the veracity of the claim made about Boreas by the Athenians in the passage that I cited referencing it. However, it is clear that the ancients saw having and recognizing divine experiences as an integral part of their own faiths. If you haven't had an experience of your own yet, take heart in knowing that it's possible you did, and the gods simply chose not to reveal that experience as what it was. Don't allow a fixation on the reality or frequency of divine experiences to become a detriment to your practice or belief. Remember that although they are a wonderful part of the faith for many of us, they were doubtless millions in antiquity who never had or recognized a divine experience and worshiped the gods all the same. We offer and pray because we love them, not because we're demanding their presence. It can be a wonderful enhancement to realize we've had a powerful UPG experience, but an all-consuming obsession or focus with the validity or frequency of them can kill the beating heart of a religious practice. Talking to others in a community about their experiences can also be an invaluable way to put your own or lack thereof into perspective. A relationship with the gods, like all relationships, are unique. However, commiserating and connecting can be a great way for us to share those experiences and to share in that community in building our faith. I hope that at the very least my video has helped you determine where your experience falls and what steps you can take to discern its meaning. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, doubt the subscribe button and assume the like is a hallucination. Drop down into the comments and let me know all about your divine experiences or the doubts you have about them. Or just tell me that my experiences with the gods are all hallucinations if that's your speed. This is a warning, by the way. I normally don't moderate comments, but if I see anti-UPG comments on other people's shares, not talking about mine, then I will be deleting them. We do not need to make things harder on each other in this community, and anti-theism has no place in my comments anyway. Special thanks to GaelicNox for the channel art. As always, links are in the description below to their website and Twitter. And special thanks to my patrons. There are a ton of new folks in the past month, and I'm so grateful for your support. Channel memberships now have custom art because of your contributions, and the server now has special meme emotes as well. My channel members, if they're not also patrons, will start appearing on this list in their own category next week. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.